Let's begin. Traditional types of trauma, in other words, what people normally think of as trauma. You guys, of course, won't be surprised with violent crime, assault, those kinds of things, but we also think of them as natural disasters and car accidents and prolonged illness and a whole host of things. Primarily the way we look at trauma, at least in the United States, has a lot to do with how we use it, how we diagnose it since 1980, which is we're looking for an experience that somebody had that is outside of the normal experience and that it is so overwhelming to them that it creates symptomology. But the reality is that only accounts for a very small portion of what we deal with in the way of trauma symptoms. We're really looking at, if you want to look at it more accurately, we're looking at the big bad events being in high intensity experiences that don't usually have a lot of frequency and they don't usually have a lot of duration. And that's significant. That probably represents about 20% of what we deal with in being trauma related. And probably a lot of your folks will fit into that category. But much more problematic for us is actually the next category, which is low intensity but high frequency activation. And those account for about 70% of the symptoms that we see. So it's not surprising when you look at the blood work of somebody that has been in a military action and what I call the cocktail, if you will, the catecholamines, the adrenals, the cortisols, and the other chemicals in their system are in fairly high levels. And we all say, well, yeah, of course they had this big bad event. But what about the kid that is in foster care or that is just having small, little doses of this, multiple times a day? Well, what we have found in some of that research is that they have actually sometimes higher amounts of that stuff in their system than military people in triage units in service. That's a pretty scary thing when you start thinking about it, because once you breach a certain amount of this in your system, you're going to start to see symptoms. And a lot of times, because we don't have a big bad event to attach it to, what we end up doing is saying, well, that must be some kind of a character issue. And that is a real problem that we have, at least in the mental health field. And we also have that problem in education. I am not in the legal field enough to know if you also struggle with it, but my guess would be that you probably do. And then the last one, which accounts for some, but not really a big number, is the low frequency, the low intensity, high frequency, high duration. This would be like someone that is a prolonged caregiver to someone that is a chronic illness or end of life type of thing. So it isn't as clear as saying this big bad thing happened to them. It is much broader than that, and it's much more pervasive in our society. When we look at surveys of adults, not children, when we look at survey of adults that enter the legal system for some kind of criminal behavior, you usually have about 90% of them that have a history of dysregulation, primarily in that middle category. Does that surprise anybody? So none of these are really what we would consider traumatic. Instead, what we want you to do is understand that these are environmental activators that affect the way the central nervous system responds. It is the central nervous system response that's problematic, because we are designed by nature to be self-healing and to be, this body just does that all on its own. It doesn't ask your permission. It's not something you think about. It is just the way we are designed by nature. Every once in a while, people get kind of irritated at me saying that a bunch of times. And I said, well, if it's either an accident of evolution or it's an intentional design, either way, you argue with somebody else but me on it. So let's go ahead and move forward. When the autonomic nervous system is thrown out of balance, and an easy way to kind of think about this is that if we're in balance, we have access to all of our capacity as human beings. But what that really means is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system are working in tandem, and that we have balance, if you will. We are well regulated. We have self-control. We're self-reflective. When that system gets thrown out of balance and the sympathetic system takes over, then the body shifts along with that change. And the two primary ways that we shift is we move into what we call adaptive processes and mitigating processes. So let me talk a little bit about adaptive processes and put these in perspective for you. And we're going to start with something really simple. How many of you have cut your finger on a piece of paper? Got a paper cut before? So I'm going to talk about a paper cut from a point of view of physiology, which may be a different point of view for you. But the moment the body recognizes that a wound or hurt has occurred, the thing it does first and foremost is send a flush of chemicals to that area to create inflammation. What is the purpose of inflammation? Well, medical people will tell you that one of the purposes of inflammation is to seal the wound so that it doesn't continue to bleed and it can be prepared to heal. The next wave of chemicals right behind that are those chemicals that create or generate the beginnings of mending it. Now, what will happen is when it gets mended enough, the body will back off on the inflammatories. So you've had a paper cut before, and you can see it isn't completely healed, but it doesn't hurt anymore. Well, what has happened is that inflammation has been withdrawn because it's no longer necessary. That's an adaptive process. Your body didn't ask for permission to do that. It didn't send you a memo saying, hey, I'm going to do this. It just did it because you're designed that way. Does that make sense? The other piece that we do, we have a tremendous capacity to mitigate. And mitigate is very simple. If you think of it this way, that the body's having an experience of some kind, but it is so distressing or dangerous or intolerable that the body itself creates space between that experience and the perception of the person. In other words, they create a space in there. And we see this all the time. If you have ever worked with like veterans, many of them will report that when they were in active duty getting shot or wounded and not realizing it for some period of time. Until somebody said, hey, you're bleeding, and then all of a sudden that they felt that. We've seen it in a number